They threw me out to freeze, but the stone knew how to keep me alive.
November 14th, 1873. Judith Basin, Montana Territory. 23 degrees Fahrenheit and still falling. Winifred Ireton stood at the edge of a dead man's claim and watched smoke rise from a chimney that used to mean something to her. The cabin behind that smoke was one she had largely built herself log by log through 18 months of mornings that started before light and ended after dark. The walls were her work. The furniture was her work. The root cellar dug into the hillside was her work, and none of it belonged to her anymore. Her sister Prue stood in the doorway 20 yards back, not coming out, not calling after her, just standing there with both hands wrapped around the doorframe like she needed something solid to hold on to, while Winifred walked away carrying everything she owned in a flour sack printed with faded flowers. $3 silver from the household tin. That was the accusation. Simple enough to say, hard enough to disprove when the man making it had been homesteading Judith Basin since 1868, and every neighbor within 12 miles had eaten at his table at least once. Aldrich Tidewater carried weight in this valley, the way certain men do not, through any particular wisdom, but through the simple accumulation of years and the confidence that comes from never having been seriously wrong in public. Winifred had not taken those $3. She had never touched that tin, but she had learned something important in the hours after the accusation was made and before she was told to leave. She had learned it through a wall. The cabin walls were 2 inches of pine board, and sound carried through pine board the way water carries through sand. She had been in the back room gathering her things when she heard Aldrich talking to Prue in the main room. Not about silver dollars, about land. His voice had the flat, certain tone of a man explaining something he had already decided. The acreage on the left side of the creek, he said, was worth twice what he had been working. Adding it to his existing claim would require consolidation. Consolidation required that the current occupant hold no legal standing. A widow with no filed homestead claim held no legal standing. She just needed a reason to go. Prue said nothing. Winifred stood in the back room with her hand flat against the pine wall and understood that her sister had known this was coming. Not just that Aldrich had planned it, but that Prue had weighed the calculation and chosen survival over blood, a warm house over the harder thing, and had decided not to warn her. That was the moment that would take the longest to heal. Not the false accusation, not the loss of the land, the silence on the other side of the wall. When Aldrich read the accusation in the main room with Prue standing 2 feet away, Winifred looked at her sister and waited. Prue looked at the floor. That was the answer. Winifred did not argue. There was nothing to argue with in a room where the verdict had been decided before the hearing began. She picked up the flour sack. She walked to the door, and then she stopped, not from hesitation, but because she had remembered something. She turned back and took one item she was certain Aldrich had never thought about. On the shelf behind the door, tucked between a broken lantern and a folded piece of oilcloth, was a small leather notebook. Her husband had carried it everywhere during the 2 years before he froze to death on the trap line in January of 1872. He had been useless with tools and worse with animals, but he had an eye for terrain that Winifred had always respected, and the notebook was full of hand-drawn maps, elevation sketches, the locations of springs and rock formations he had noted during his wanderings. He had also on one particular page copied down a list of edible roots and winter plants he had learned from a Blackfoot trapper who passed through in the autumn of 1871. He had never used that list. He had died before winter made it necessary. Winifred slipped the notebook into the flour sack. Aldrich did not notice. He was already looking past her toward the door. She walked out. She did not look back at Prue. The nearest settlement was Fort Benton, 67 miles north across open prairie. Every practical calculation pointed toward Fort Benton. Charity House's laundry work, the thin safety of numbers. Every person who saw her walking west instead of north would have said she was making a mistake. She was not making a mistake. 3 miles west of the Tidewater claim, during a water haul the previous spring, Winifred had noticed the sandstone formations rising from the hillside. Cliff faces honeycombed with wind-carved alcoves, some shallow as a dog's bed, others cutting back 30 feet or more into the rock. She had registered them the way her grandmother had taught her to register things, not with excitement, but with the quiet attention of someone who understood that the landscape held information, and that information was a form of survival. Her grandmother Marta had lived in the Carpathian foothills of southern Poland. She had survived the failed uprising of 1863, not because she was stronger than the people who died, but because she understood something they did not, which was that the earth itself, if you knew how to read it, offered better protection than anything made of wood or plaster. After the Russian soldiers came through and burned what they could burn, the families that survived the following winter were not the ones in the sturdiest houses. They were the ones who went underground, who found the places where rock replaced air and where the wild temperature swings that killed exposed livestock and froze improperly stored food simply did not exist. Her grandmother had explained it simply. Stone absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. It does not react to what is happening on the surface. It does not know that a north wind is driving temperatures down 40 degrees in 6 hours. It holds what it has absorbed and gives it back at its own pace, steady and indifferent to whatever madness the weather above is performing. You could build a fire in a stone space in the morning, let the walls and floor drink that heat in, and those surfaces would still be releasing warmth at midnight. Not roaring heat, not the kind of heat that needed constant feeding. The quiet kind, the reliable kind, the kind that keeps you alive when everything outside is trying to end you. She had thought about those words 100 times since coming to Montana. She had thought about them when her husband was still alive and still talking about the fortune they would make trapping, and she had thought about them after he died, and she was trying to figure out how to remain alive in a place that had already demonstrated its willingness to kill the people she loved. She reached the sandstone formations before dusk. The alcove she chose was set back from the face of the cliff approximately 12 feet wide and 22 feet deep, with a ceiling that dropped from 7 feet at the entrance to just under 5 feet at the back wall. The floor was uneven but sloped upward toward the rear, which suited her perfectly. Cold air, being heavier than warm air, would settle at the entrance. The back of the alcove would stay several degrees warmer than the front without any effort on her part. She would sleep at the high end. That first night, wrapped in both dresses and the single wool blanket she had managed to keep, Winifred sat against the back wall and listened to the sounds of a Montana winter beginning its work. Coyotes somewhere below in the draws, wind moving through the cottonwoods along the creek, and then faint but unmistakable the long territorial call of a wolf pack working the high country of the Highwood Peaks, 15 miles north. The temperature inside the alcove held at 47 degrees. Outside, it had dropped to 19. For the first time since her husband had been brought back on a board in January of 1872, Winifred Ireton slept straight through to morning without waking. She spent the next 4 days doing what needed to be done. The creek bottom below the formation was full of cottonwood deadfall branches and sections of trunk that had come down in the summer floods and dried through the months since. Each piece needed to be carried 3 miles uphill. Winifred made 11 trips in 4 days, and on the 11th trip, her right knee began a low, persistent protest that she noted and ignored. She found the abandoned line shack from the railroad survey of 1871 on her second day out. The structure had been left unmaintained since the survey team departed and had spent 2 years in a slow negotiation with gravity and weather. She pulled 10 boards from its walls before the whole thing gave up entirely and pancaked into the sage with a sound like a gunshot. She also recovered 6 feet of rusted chain, 3 bent nails, a cracked shovel blade, and a pair of leather work gloves that had frozen solid inside the ruins. They were too small for her hands. She wore them anyway. On the 5th day, she heard a freight wagon on the Carroll Trail below and climbed down to meet it. The driver was not a man. Florrie Coldwell was somewhere past 50, built wide through the shoulders, with the particular kind of squint that came from spending decades reading weather at distance. She drove a 4-horse freight outfit for one of the Helena supply companies, one of the only women working that route in either direction, which meant she had spent years proving something that Winifred understood without needing it explained. Florrie heard the shape of Winifred's English before she heard the words inside it. She tilted her head slightly the way a person does when they recognize the rhythm of a language they grew up with. In Polish, Winifred said, "Only I need to make a trade." Florrie looked at the flour sack, looked at Winifred's hands, which were cracked at the knuckles from cold and work. Then she looked at the ring on Winifred's left hand, a plain gold band that had been her grandmother Marta's before it was her own. She said in the same language, "That ring is worth more than anything I have on this wagon." Winifred said, "I know, but it will not keep me warm." Florrie was quiet for a moment. Then she climbed down and opened the back of the wagon. She had a handsaw with 7 broken teeth, a hammer missing half its handle, and a tarpaulin so riddled with holes it would have shamed a proper seamstress. She laid them out on the wagon gate. Then she added a coil of hemp rope that had not been part of any negotiations, set it beside the other items without comment or explanation, and waited. Winifred took the ring from her finger and placed it in Florrie's hand. The older woman closed her fist around it and held it there for a moment before putting it in her coat pocket. She looked at Winifred one more time with an expression that was not pity and was not quite admiration, but lived somewhere between the two. Then she climbed back onto her wagon and drove south without looking back. Winifred stood on the trail holding a broken saw and a hammer with half a handle, and for the first time in 5 days she felt something that was not cold or hunger or calculation. She could not have named it precisely. It felt something like being understood. The construction of the alcove's front wall took 3 days. She set vertical cottonwood poles 18 inches apart. In shallow holes she dug with the cracked shovel blade, packed the gaps with clay from the creek bank, mixed with dry grass, and braced the whole assembly with horizontal stringers lashed using strips she cut from her husband's old leather belt. She left a doorway on the south side 3 feet wide and hung the tarpaulin across it, weighted at the bottom with stones. 8 feet inside that first wall, she built a second one. This created an air gap between the two surfaces, a pocket of trapped stillness that would hold warmth the way a second skin holds body heat. The rear section behind the inner wall she reserved for sleeping and storage. The heating system was the most important part, and she built it last when she had thought through every detail. She dug a fire pit 18 inches deep at the cave's mouth just inside the entrance and below the main living space. She lined it with flat sandstone slabs, fitting them tightly the way her grandmother had taught her. No mortar, just stone against stone, until the fit was correct and the gaps were sealed by pressure and patience. Then she built a chimney from stacked rock and clay that ran along the ceiling of the entrance passage and vented out through a gap at the very top of the front wall. The logic was simple and several thousand years old. Air from outside fed the fire at the bottom. Heat rose through the stone-lined pit and along the ceiling channel. Smoke followed the heat upward and out. The living space behind, separated from the fire pit by the alcove's natural angle, received radiant warmth from the heated stones without receiving smoke. The stones would continue releasing that warmth long after the fire itself had died, measured in hours, not minutes. It was the same principle that shepherds in the Carpathians had used for generations. The same principle her grandmother had used in the winter of 1863, when the alternatives had run out. Winifred did not think of it as ingenuity. She thought of it as memory, as the accumulated knowledge of women who had kept families alive in cold places, and passed that knowledge forward in the particular way that women did not, in books or formal instruction, but in the texture of an explanation, given while hands were busy with something else, while bread was being shaped or wool was being carded, while the work of living was already underway. She tested the system on the evening of November 28th, a month after she had walked away from the Tidewater claim with a flour sack and nothing else. She built a fire in the pit, fed it until the stones glowed orange, then let it die down and sealed the entrance with the tarpaulin. She sat in the back of the alcove with her hands in her lap and waited. The temperature outside that night fell to 11 below zero. Inside the rear chamber, the air held at 51 degrees. She did not celebrate this. She noted it the way her grandmother had taught her to note things without excitement, as information that was now confirmed and could be acted upon. Then she opened the leather notebook, turned to a blank page, and began adding to her husband's maps. The drainage patterns she had memorized on her trips to the creek, the wind directions at different times of day, the locations of the berry stands and the animal trails, and the flat rock areas where the snow cleared first in a thaw. She worked until the lamplight grew uncertain, then folded the notebook closed and lay down on her blanket on the slope of the rear floor. The wolves were working the high country again. She could hear them faintly between the intervals of wind. She slept. December arrived the way Montana Decembers do, not with ceremony, but with a kind of flat, impersonal commitment. The temperature dropped below zero on the 8th and stayed there for 6 straight days. Winifred woke each morning in the rear chamber, pressed her palm to the hearthstones from the previous night's burn, felt them still holding warmth, then walked forward to the entrance and stepped outside into air so cold it crystallized her breath before it could disperse. She had taken work in Udita, the settlement 12 miles east, mucking stables and hauling water for whoever would pay in food instead of coin. The work paid in flour, dried salt pork, and once a small wheel of hard cheese from a German family named Muller, who seemed embarrassed by their own generosity. Not enough calories, never quite enough, but enough to calculate against which was the only form of security available to her. It was during one of those trips to Udita that she first encountered Orval Ashby. He was a large man gone gray in the mustache, but not the eyes, which were the particular pale blue of very cold water. He had homesteaded the Judith Basin area in 1868 and survived winters that had killed men with more supplies and better equipment. He did not carry his authority loudly. He carried it the way certain rocks carry weight without announcement, simply present and unmovable. He found her on the second week of December standing at the cave entrance with an armload of cottonwood she had just hauled up the slope. He introduced himself and told her he had heard about her situation, which was the polite way of saying that every person in Udita already knew about the Tidewater claim, the $3 silver, and the Polish widow living in a hole in the rocks west of town. Then he told her about the Peterson family. He told it without drama, in the same even voice he used for everything, which somehow made it worse. 4 of them, he said, a man and his wife and their 2 children ages 7 and 4. They had built a dugout shelter in the winter of 1870 and decided to stay in it through the following January when the weather turned severe. They had sealed the entrance tight to hold the warmth. The fire consumed the available oxygen faster than the sealed space could replenish it. Carbon monoxide from the incomplete combustion accumulated while they slept. He found them in March of 1871 when the snow cleared enough to reach the entrance. All 4, in their blankets. Looking, he said, like they had simply decided to sleep a little longer. Winifred listened to this without interrupting. When he was finished, she said, "Would you like to come inside and see how the ventilation works?" Ashby looked at the entrance for a moment. Then he said, "No, I have seen enough to know." He said it without hostility. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had seen a specific terrible thing and had drawn a specific conclusion from it. And that conclusion was now a fixed point in his understanding of the world, as solid as the limestone under the prairie, and he saw no reason to examine it further. He turned and walked back toward the Carroll Trail. Winifred watched him go. She felt something she had not expected to feel. Not anger, not the particular frustrated helplessness of arguing with someone who has already decided. What she felt was a kind of tiredness she had not known before, a weariness that had nothing to do with the work of hauling wood, or the cold of the mornings, or the shortfall in her calorie count. It was the tiredness that came from being evaluated by someone who had not looked from having a verdict rendered before the evidence was examined. She had grown up with that tiredness in Poland, where her family's status as educated Poles in a region administered by people who had decided what educated Poles were before they met any of them, meant that the evaluation always preceded the encounter. She had hoped that the frontier might be different. It was different in some ways. In this way, it was not. What she did not know, and would not learn until later, was what Ashby did on his way back to Udita. He stopped at 3 separate homesteads along the Carroll Trail. At each one, he told the occupants that the Polish woman's shelter was a death trap. He said it without malice, as a warning, as what he believed to be a public service. He described the ventilation problem in careful detail, referenced the Peterson family, and advised the settlers that if they were caught in weather between Udita and the river, they should not seek shelter at the rock formation to the west. He believed he was protecting people. He was not wrong to believe that a poorly ventilated underground structure could kill. He was simply wrong about this particular structure. And the result of his warnings was that Winifred spent the most dangerous weeks of her first winter cut off from the network of mutual assistance that was the only real insurance available to frontier settlers. She did not know this yet. Reverend Amos Colquhoun found the alcove in early December, following a report from one of his congregation that a Polish woman was living in a cave west of town. He arrived on a gray morning with the careful, unhurried step of a man who had delivered bad news in enough forms to know that approach mattered. He stood at the entrance and looked in at the walls, the fire pit, the canvas divider Winifred had hung to separate her sleeping space from the front chamber. He said, "My child, this is not shelter. This is desperation. A woman alone in a cave 3 miles from the nearest Christian soul." Winifred had heard this kind of concern before from men who confused their discomfort with her situation for her discomfort with her situation. She said the temperature inside last night was 48 degrees. Outside, it was 9 below. I am not sure desperation accounts for that difference. Reverend Colquhoun shook his head with the expression of a man receiving an answer that did not address his actual concern. He said, I have buried 17 souls in this territory since August. Most of them had better shelter than this. There is no shame in accepting help from the church. She thanked him for his concern and for the small portion of dried beans he had brought, and she kept working on the clay chinking along the south wall while he spoke. When he left, she understood that his description of her circumstances would travel back to Udita and become part of the official community narrative about her. She could not prevent that narrative. She could only continue building something that would eventually make it irrelevant. What she knew was that her lamp oil was running lower than she had calculated. She had been burning it slightly too long. Each evening had allowed herself the luxury of reading a few extra pages of her husband's notes before sleep. And now she sat in the rear chamber on the night of the 15th of December, with the flame turned down as far as it would go, without guttering out, working through her numbers in the near dark. Flour, salt pork, the hard cheese from the Muller family. Enough through January, possibly into the first week of February if she reduced her portions. After that, the calculation became a different kind of problem. She had set 6 snares along the creek bottom, 3 rabbits in 2 weeks. She was realistic about what that represented in terms of caloric value. It was not enough to close the gap. She turned the lamp down another fraction until the flame was barely a blue thread above the wick. The alcove seemed to contract around her, the stone ceiling and walls pressing slightly closer in the near dark. Outside, she could hear the intermittent moan of wind finding the gaps in her front wall and testing them. She sat with that sound for a while and let herself feel the question she had been keeping at the back of her mind since November 14th. Not the practical question of how to survive, which was a problem with components and solutions. The other question, the one about whether she was living in this rock or simply waiting to die in it in a way that she had chosen for herself. It was not a feeling she was accustomed to. She had always had the capacity to act, and action had always been sufficient to suppress that particular variety of darkness. But in this moment, in this nearly lightless space with the cold pressing against the other side of her walls, and the lamplight barely distinguishing itself from the dark around it, she understood for the first time that survival required something beyond capacity for action. It required a reason to act that was still present when the cold and the silence and the arithmetic of insufficient food stripped everything else away. She reached for the leather notebook and opened it in the near dark, turning to the page she had found on her first careful reading. The list was in her husband's handwriting, a careful column of names and descriptions in his slightly cramped hand. He had written it in the autumn of 1871, after 2 hours of conversation with a Blackfoot trapper at the trading post in Fort Benton, an older man who had apparently been amused and then impressed by the young Polish immigrants' genuine interest in what grew in the ground and what it could be used for. Wild turnip, biscuit root, cattail roots in the frozen creek margins, several varieties of grass seeds that could be ground and added to flour. Her husband had written all of it down with the care of a man who understood that information was currency. He had never needed to use it. He had died that winter without ever returning to the trading post, without ever meeting the old trapper again. Winifred read the list in the minimal light and then tore the page carefully from the notebook along its binding, folded it 4 times, and tucked it into the pocket of her dress against her sternum, where it would stay warm and dry. She closed the notebook. In the dark, she did what she had always done when the darkness was not just outside but inside. She began to work. She reopened the notebook to a blank page and started drawing. Not from memory, but from everything she had learned in the 6 weeks since she had chosen this rock formation over the road to Fort Benton. The slope of the drainage above the cliff face that directed snowmelt east rather than into the alcove entrance. The exact angle of the prevailing wind that made the fire pit position correct. The location of a second alcove shallower than hers that could be improved with minimal labor and might serve a second person through a bad night. She drew until the lamplight genuinely failed. Then she lay down on her blanket in the dark and listened to Montana doing what Montana did, and decided without ceremony or drama that she was going to be here in the spring. The next morning, she refilled the lamp from her last quarter bottle of oil, rationing herself to 2 hours of light per evening until she could trade for more in Udita. Then she put on her husband's leather gloves, still too small, and went out to check her snares. On the way down to the creek, she began looking for wild turnip. Oscar Engqvist arrived on the 19th of December carrying a sack of potatoes, a string of dried beef, and the particular expression of a man who had already decided what kind of situation he was walking into before he arrived. He was 42 broad through the chest with the methodical movements of someone who had spent years learning that brute force was more reliable than cleverness. He had filed a homestead claim 4 miles south in the spring of 1872 and had been building his operation with the steady, humorless determination that characterized a certain kind of Scandinavian settler, a man who did not complain because complaining implied that the difficulty was unexpected, and nothing about Montana Territory had been unexpected to him. He had expected it to be hard. It was hard. This confirmed his general understanding of the world and gave him no particular information worth acting on. He had heard about the Polish widow in the rock formation from Reverend Amos Colquhoun, who ran the small congregation in Udita with genuine care and limited awareness of when his care caused problems. The Reverend had described Winifred's situation to his congregation the previous Sunday in the particular tone reserved for cases requiring charitable response, a warm, slightly sorrowful tone that framed the subject as someone who needed to be helped rather than someone who was helping themselves. The congregation had listened with appropriate sympathy. Oscar had decided to bring food. He set the sack and the dried beef on the ground just inside the entrance and looked around the front chamber with the careful measuring attention of a man assessing structural quality. His eyes moved from the wall construction to the ceiling clearance to the fire pit position at the entrance. His expression did not change, but something behind it shifted slightly, the particular recalibration of a person encountering something that does not match the picture they had prepared. He said, "You have done better than I expected." Winifred was at the inner wall checking the clay, chinking on the south section, where a small crack had appeared in the cold. She did not stop what she was doing. She said, "What did you expect?" He considered this honestly. "A hole with a fire in it," he said, "something temporary." She pressed a fresh mixture of clay and dry grass into the crack with her thumb, working it in evenly. She said, "It is not temporary. When spring comes and you rebuild that cabin of yours, you might consider what you are looking at before you start." Oscar looked at the inner wall, the air gap between the two surfaces, the way the fire pit angle directed heat into the living space rather than out through the entrance. He looked for longer than a man who had already made up his mind would look. Then he said, "When spring comes, the church has land available near Udita. I could speak to Reverend Colquhoun about a proper arrangement, something with a roof." Winifred turned from the wall and looked at him directly for the first time. She said, "The proper arrangement I have is one that nobody can take from me. That is what I require in an arrangement." Oscar did not understand the full weight of those words. He heard something about independence, something perhaps about pride, and filed it under the category of understandable stubbornness in difficult circumstances. He thanked her for his time, told her the food was freely given, and walked back toward the Carroll Trail. Winifred watched him go and then turned back to the crack in the wall. She finished the chinking with 3 more passes of her thumb. The clay would need to dry overnight before she could test it. She ate 2 potatoes that evening, boiled in the small iron pot she had salvaged from the railroad shack. They were the best things she had tasted in 5 weeks. 2 days later, Oscar Engqvist came back. This time he was not carrying food. He was carrying a question. He had spent 3 nights in wet blankets while his stove consumed half-green firewood that produced smoke in quantities sufficient to warrant evacuation and heat in quantities insufficient to warm a medium-sized dog. The clay he had used to chink his cabin walls had cracked as it dried exactly as Winifred had observed the day he arrived, and the first heavy snowfall had melted on his iron stovepipe run down to the eaves and refrozen into dams that directed meltwater straight through the gaps. His stored supplies were damp. His firewood was damp. He himself was damp in the particular miserable way that made sleep impossible and work dangerous. He stood at the entrance of the alcove and said, "I need to get dry." Winifred looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Front chamber. You contribute firewood split in stacked not green rounds. You stay no more than 2 nights without working on something that needs doing. Those are the terms." Oscar said, "Those are reasonable terms." He spread his blanket on the floor of the front chamber that night and lay down fully dressed with his boots near the hearthstones. In the morning he was dry. He lay still for a few minutes after waking aware of the fact of his dryness, with an attention he had not given it before, the way a person only truly notices the absence of pain after it has finally stopped. He rose and stood at the entrance, looking up at the overhang of sandstone above the front wall. 3 feet of solid rock. No accumulation of snow. No ice formation at the eaves because there were no eaves. No meltwater channel because there was nothing to melt. The logic of it settled into him the way cold settles into a room gradually and completely. He did not go back to his cabin that day. On the fourth morning, he asked whether she would object if he improved the door situation, the tarpaulin entrance being functional, but not ideal against sustained wind. Winifred said she would not object. He spent the day constructing a proper door frame from lumber he had brought on his second visit, fitting it into the front wall opening with the precision of a man who had been working with wood long enough to do it correctly the first time. The door he hung was not elegant, but it sealed. When he closed it, the draft that had been working through the tarpaulin's lower edge stopped completely. By Christmas, the alcove had a door that closed a reinforced inner wall and a sleeping platform in the rear chamber, built 8 inches off the floor from lumber scraps, which Winifred acknowledged was an improvement she had not gotten around to making herself. Oscar hung a canvas divider between the 2 sleeping areas because he was a practical man, and propriety was a practical matter. He began referring to the space as our cave, in the offhand way of someone who has stopped tracking ownership the way a person stops tracking which half of a shared meal was theirs once they are full. Winifred noted this without commenting on it. She had built this space from nothing in a week of hard labor, with a broken saw and half a hammer. She had designed the heating system, calculated the ventilation, chosen the alcove for its specific geological properties. She understood that Oscar's contributions were real and genuinely useful. She also understood that the particular ease with which men move from visitor to co-owner was its own kind of information worth filing alongside the other things she had learned in the past 2 months about how the world worked out here. She said nothing about it, but she kept her husband's leather notebook in her own coat pocket and not on the shared shelf. The second week of January brought Halcott Yarrow. He came on a gray Tuesday morning when Winifred was alone, Oscar having gone to Udita for supplies. She heard the horse before she saw the rider, and when she stepped outside, she found a man in his mid-50s dismounting with the deliberate movements of someone who has planned what he is going to say and wants his arrival to communicate authority before he opens his mouth. Yarrow had filed a homestead claim on the acreage immediately east of the Sandstone Formation in 1868. He was not a large operation by the standards of the valley, but he had been there long enough to develop the particular territorial confidence of men who arrive early to a place and thereafter regard latecomer as a category that includes everyone who came after them. He had also, in 1871, submitted an application to the territorial government for mineral extraction rights on the Sandstone Formation itself. The application had been under review since then, which in practical terms meant it was sitting in a file somewhere in a government office in Helena with no particular urgency attached to it. It had never been approved. He had never been told it was denied. He had been operating for 2 years in the comfortable ambiguity of that space between approval and rejection. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat and held it out to Winifred. He called it a notice of public land occupation. Winifred took the paper and read it. It was handwritten on plain paper in Yarrow's own hand. It cited no specific statute. It referenced no filing number. It bore no official seal of any government body, territorial, federal, or otherwise. It contained Yarrow's name, a description of the land in question, and the assertion that his prior claim to the mineral rights of the formation superseded any occupancy not authorized by his permission. She folded it and held it back to him. She said, "You can return when this has a seal on it." Yarrow did not take the paper back immediately. He stood holding it extended between them and looked past her into the front chamber of the alcove, taking inventory with the unhurried attention of a man calculating what something is worth. He said, "I have been patient about this. I want you to understand that. I did not come here the day I heard you had moved in. I gave you time to get settled, time to understand the situation." Winifred said, "I understand the situation. The situation is that you have a piece of paper you wrote yourself. When you have one that a government office wrote, come back." Yarrow took the paper. He folded it and put it back in his coat pocket without looking away from her. He said, "I will be back, Mrs. Ayrton, that I can promise." He mounted his horse and rode east. Winifred stood at the entrance and watched him go. The coal was settling into the 20s again, the kind of temperature that made every motion deliberate and every miscalculation expensive. She went back inside and stood at the inner wall for a moment, with her hands flat against the stone, feeling the residual warmth in the surface from the morning fire. 3 days later, she went to check her northernmost snare line and found the snare at the end of it bent cleanly backward, the trigger mechanism snapped in a way that suggested hands rather than weather. She stood over it for a moment in the particular stillness that comes from understanding something clearly and having no remedy available. Then she walked to the next snare in the line. It was intact. The one after that had been stepped on the mechanism compressed into the frozen ground. No animal had done that. She rebuilt both snares from the materials she had on hand and said nothing to Oscar when he returned from Udita that evening. The following week, Orval Ashby came to the alcove for the second time. He had been to Yarrow's place the previous day, he said, to look at some harness work. He mentioned this without apparent significance in the same flat informational tone he used for most things. Then he came inside for the first time, stepping through the door Oscar had built, and looking around the front chamber with the same careful assessment Oscar had used on his first visit, though the purpose behind Ashby's assessment felt different in a way Winifred could feel, without being able to fully articulate. He said, "Yarrow tells me you are collecting fees for overnight shelter on public land." Winifred was at the fire pit adding wood to build the evening burn. She did not look up. She said, "I collect firewood, not fees." Ashby said, "Still a charge for use of land that is not yours." She set the last piece of cottonwood on the fire and stood. She turned to face him. She said, "I set the poles with my hands. I mixed the clay with my hands. I hauled the cottonwood 3 miles uphill and split it and stacked it. What you are standing inside did not exist before I built it. Tell me what part of that belongs to Halcott Yarrow." Ashby said nothing for a moment. His expression did not change. He looked at Oscar, who was standing against the far wall. He said, "Yarrow is filing with the territorial office. He has prior mineral extraction rights on this formation going back to 1871. If that application is approved, your occupancy has no legal standing." "Winifred," said Mr. Ashby, "the door's behind you." After Ashby left, Oscar asked her whether she was worried. Winifred reached into her coat and removed the leather notebook. She opened it to the page she had been adding to since her first week in the alcove, the page that had begun as her husband's terrain, notes from 1871, and had gradually expanded into something more detailed. She found the section she wanted and laid the notebook open on the sleeping platform. Her husband had sketched the boundary lines from the 1869 survey as he had observed them during his wanderings in the valley, locating them relative to specific rock formations and drainage patterns, with the careful spatial reasoning of a man who moved through terrain with genuine attention. The sandstone formation was marked. The boundary of the nearest file claim was also marked. Between the two was a gap that the survey lines made clear. She said this formation sits outside the boundary of every registered claim in this valley, including the one Yarrow filed in 1868. His mineral application from 1871 was never approved because the surveyed boundary of his claim does not extend to this rock. He knows that. That is why his application has been sitting in Helena for 2 years without a decision. Oscar looked at the map for a long time. Then he said, "Your husband drew this." Winifred said, "He started it, I finished it." Oscar looked up at her. He said, "How long have you known about Yarrow's filing?" She said, "Since the day I chose this alcove." He looked at her differently after that. Not with a new respect exactly, because his respect had been building incrementally since the morning he woke up dry, but with a recognition that the person he was sharing this space with had understood the full geometry of her situation from the beginning and had chosen her ground accordingly, the way a tactician chooses high ground before anyone else arrives to contest it. He began splitting firewood the next morning with noticeably more investment. The warming station, as it had come to be known informally along the Carroll Trail, served its first real test in the second week of January. A rancher named Forsyth came in half frozen after his horse threw a shoe 4 miles out and spent the night in the front chamber. 2 nights after that, a young couple whose wagon had broken an axle needed shelter, while the husband walked to Udita for parts. The wife had 2 children with her, a boy of about 5, and an infant wrapped so many times in wool blanket that only its face was visible. Winifred moved to the rear chamber and gave the family the front space. She added extra wood to the evening burn and did not charge them anything because the woman had nothing to offer. This was an exception to the terms she had set with Oscar, and she did not explain it. He did not ask her to. Among those who passed through in those weeks was a young man Winifred did not know by name, the son-in-law of Orville Ashby, a recent arrival to Montana Territory, who had the unformed quality of someone whose plan had not survived contact with actual conditions. He stayed one night, ate the broth she made from salt pork and dried turnip root, and left before dawn with a nod of thanks. He had no idea whose shelter he was in or what Ashby had said about it on 3 homesteads along the Carroll Trail. Winifred knew all of this and said nothing. On the 28th of January, 1874, the sky changed. She had seen that particular color once before in the winter of 1872, when her husband had gone out on what should have been a 2-hour run of the trap line and had not come back. A yellow-gray, the color of old bone, with a stillness to it that was not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of something enormous gathering itself before it moved. The barometric pressure had been dropping since before noon. She could feel it in the particular way the fire drew, pulling harder than usual, air rushing in under the door and through every small gap in the walls, with an urgency that was the building's way of expressing what the atmosphere was doing. By 2 in the afternoon, the temperature had fallen 12 degrees in 3 hours. By 3, the snow was moving horizontally. Oscar had gone to Udita that morning for supplies and timber. He had planned to return by noon. He was not back by noon. He was not back by 2 o'clock. By 3 o'clock, Winifred had made her assessment of the situation and begun acting on it. She built the fire in the pit up to the maximum the stones could receive, filling the chamber with heat that the rock would store and release through the night. She hung an additional canvas layer across the inner wall opening to create a second thermal barrier in the rear chamber. She put water on to heat. Then she went to the entrance, opened the door against the resistance of the wind, and stood listening. The sound of a Montana blizzard at full intensity is not a single sound. It is a layered thing, the sustained bass note of wind moving at sustained high speed, and over that the higher percussion of ice crystals striking the rock face, and through all of it the intermittent groaning of the formation itself under thermal stress. Against those layers she was listening for something that did not belong, a rhythm or a pitch that was biological rather than geological. She heard nothing for an hour. Then just after 7 in the evening she heard the horse. She found it 12 yards from the entrance, standing against the base of the cliff face with its head down and its legs locked past the point of moving forward and not yet at the point of lying down. Oscar was still in the saddle. His hands had frozen around the reins in the position of gripping, and she had to work them loose finger by finger, which was a slow and cold process that required patience. She assembled from somewhere she did not know she had. He was breathing. His face was a mask of ice from his own exhaled moisture, the breath that had not gotten far before the cold reclaimed it. She could not assess the extent of the frostbite until she got him inside, which meant she needed to get him off the horse first. 180 pounds of unconscious man in a temperature of 23 below zero with a wind that was pushing the effective cold towards 60 below. She got him down in stages, working with the geometry of it rather than against it, using the horse's height and the angles of the body to guide rather than lift. It took 11 minutes. She kept count without knowing why. Then she looked at the horse. The animal had walked itself to the cliff face and stopped. It had delivered its rider to within 30 yards of shelter and then given everything it had. Leaving it outside in these conditions was a death sentence, and the horse represented 3 months of Oscar's labor in a territory where 3 months of labor was not something to be discarded on a cold night. She got her shoulder under the animal's neck, spoke to it in the low continuous murmur that her husband had taught her, worked better than commands, and walked it through the entrance into the front chamber. The horse stood in the corner opposite the fire pit and trembled for 20 minutes and then went still. Winifred gave it water and the last of the hay and went to work on Oscar. She had learned what to do with frozen flesh from her grandmother, who had learned it from the experience of a generation that encountered frostbite the way modern people encountered colds as a regular consequence of ordinary life in cold climates. You did not apply heat directly. You did not rub the affected tissue. You brought cool water and introduced warmth in the most gradual increment that the body could accept without the tissue damage that came from rapid temperature change. You wrapped. You waited. You did not leave. His feet were white and waxy to mid-calf. Both hands similarly affected. She worked with the cool water and the gradual warming for 3 hours, maintaining the temperature of the water with careful additions from the heated pot, never letting it get warm, just incrementally less cold degree by degree through the evening. He came back to consciousness around midnight, not gradually, not peacefully, but all at once, and badly fighting her hands, not knowing where he was or who she was operating from some deep instinctive terror that expressed itself as struggle. She spoke to him in Polish first, which was wrong, but was what came out, and then in English, his name repeated with the flat calm of someone who has decided not to be moved by drama. He heard his name. He stopped fighting. He lay still and breathed and gradually assembled the information available to him into something like understanding. She gave him broth. He drank it without speaking. The color was returning to his face in the slow way that was good rather than the fast way that meant something was wrong. Outside, the temperature dropped to 23 below, then to 30. Then the wind found its full strength and the number became something the thermometer in Udita could not accurately express. Inside the alcove, the front chamber held at 38 degrees. The rear chamber, sealed now behind 2 layers of canvas and stone, held at 49. The hearthstones from the evening burn were still giving back the warmth they had been given, steady and reliable, indifferent to the catastrophe occurring on the other side of the rock. By morning, Oscar could feel his fingers. He could not yet feel 2 of his toes on the right foot and 3 on the left, which Winifred noted without telling him because there was nothing useful to be said about it until the swelling allowed a proper assessment and the immediate danger was past. The storm ran 3 full days. Not 3 days of snowfall, but 3 days of temperature and wind that turned the Montana landscape into a place that did not accommodate the biological requirements of human survival. The temperature in Udita did not rise above 0 until February 1st. The wind sustained above 40 miles per hour for 30 of the intervening hours. In the front chamber of the alcove, the horse recovered its composure and accepted water and the hay ration with what seemed like genuine appreciation. In the rear chamber, Oscar's color normalized, and his frostbite declared itself first degree, painful, and serious, but not the kind that took limbs. He would lose the 2 small toes on the left foot and very likely one on the right. In Montana Territory in 1874, this was not an unusual accounting for a man who had pushed his luck against a bad winter and survived to regret it. Winifred told him about the toes on the second day when he was coherent enough to receive the information without it becoming a crisis. He was quiet for a while. Then he said the horse. She said fine. He said the supplies I brought from Udita. She said on the horse, dry. He looked at the canvas ceiling above the sleeping platform for a long moment. Then he said, I owe you a considerable debt, Mrs. Ayrton. She said, you built a door that actually closes. We are not so far behind. In Udita, 7 people died in those 3 days. 2 from carbon monoxide when they sealed their cabins too completely in an effort to retain heat. 3 from cold exposure when their firewood ran out. 2 from hypothermia when they attempted to reach neighbors and became disoriented in the ground drift. Among the details that circulated through the settlement in the aftermath was this: Halcott Yarrow, in the hours before the storm's worst intensity, had sent a hired man out to check on his cattle in the south pasture. The man had gone out at Yarrow's instruction and had not come back. He was found 2 days later, frozen in a draw less than half a mile from the barn, having lost his direction in the ground drift and walked in a circle until he could no longer walk at all. Yarrow was not charged with anything. There was nothing in the law of Montana Territory that made an employer responsible for a worker's death in a blizzard. But the settlement knew what had happened, and the settlement remembered, and the quality of a man's reputation in a small community is not determined by legal proceedings, but by what people say to each other over the fence line and at the mercantile counter in the days after a storm. Yarrow's reputation began developing a quality it had not previously had: a hairline fracture that would widen over the coming months in ways he could not fully control. Winifred noted all of this from a careful distance. In late February, a man named Shelby Foxgrove came to the alcove. He was a structural engineer employed by the Montana Central Railway, currently assigned to a survey camp near the Judith River, and he had heard about the rock shelter from a freighter who had stayed overnight in January. He arrived with a leather notebook of his own, which Winifred found immediately recognizable as the tool of a person who understood that observation was prior to everything else. He spent 2 hours in the alcove. He examined the fire pit system, the chimney channel, the double wall construction, the position of the entrance relative to the prevailing wind, and the relationship between the sleeping area elevation and the natural thermal stratification of the space. He made diagrams. He asked 2 or 3 questions, precise and technical, which Winifred answered in the same register. Then he said the Romans called this principle hypocaust when they used it in their bathhouses. Thermal mass storage with gravity-fed ventilation. The physics are identical to what you have built here. Winifred was quiet for a moment. Outside, the February cold pressed against the walls in its patient way. She said, "I do not know the Romans. I know my grandmother." Foxgrove looked at her with an expression she had not seen on the face of any man in Judith Basin since arriving. Not admiration exactly, something more precise than admiration, recognition. He wrote something in his notebook and then closed it. Before he left, he said, "What you have demonstrated here, Mrs. Ireton, will outlast every timber structure in this valley. I want you to know that I will be writing to the territorial office about this design. Not about you specifically, about the principle." After he left, Winifred stood at the entrance with the door open against the cold, looking out at the white and gray landscape of late winter Montana. Oscar came to stand beside her. He said, "What are you thinking?" She said, "I am thinking about spring." He said, "What about spring?" She said, "I am thinking that when it comes, I need to go to Fort Benton before anything else." He asked why. She reached into her coat and put her hand on the leather notebook without taking it out. She said, "Because there is a conversation I need to have with a man at the territorial office, and I would like to have it before Halcott Yarrow does." The road to Fort Benton in early March was 40 miles of mud and frozen ruts, and Winifred made it in a day and a half on a borrowed horse, sleeping 4 hours in a relay station outside Chouteau before riding the final stretch into town at first light on the second day. She had not been to Fort Benton since the autumn of 1871, when she and her husband had arrived with 2 trunks and the particular optimism of people who have committed fully to something and have not yet discovered what that commitment costs. The town had grown since then, more commercial buildings along the levee, more traffic on the river road, more of the organized noise that meant money was moving through a place. She found the territorial land office on the 2nd Street, back from the river, a frame building with a stovepipe, leaning slightly west and a hand-lettered sign above the door that had been repainted at least once over an earlier version. The clerk was a thin man named Caldwell, who wore spectacles and the expression of someone who had spent years managing the gap between what people wanted and what the law provided. He listened to Winifred without interrupting, which she noted as a professional courtesy that not everyone in his position extended to women arriving alone in dusty coats. She placed the leather notebook on his desk and opened it to the survey page. She explained what it showed, the 1869 boundary lines as her husband had recorded them in relation to the sandstone formation and the specific location of the formation relative to those lines. She explained that Halcott Yarrow had submitted a mineral extraction application in 1871, referencing this formation, and that the application had never been approved. Caldwell looked at the map for some time. He pulled a large folded document from a cabinet behind him, one of the official survey maps, and spread it on the desk beside the notebook. He compared the two in silence, moving his finger between them. Then he said, "Your husband's survey is consistent with the official record. The formation in question sits outside the registered boundary of the Yarrow claim by approximately 300 yards. The 1871 mineral application was flagged during initial review for this reason and has been pending secondary review since. Given the current workload of this office, secondary review could mean another 3 years." Winifred said, "But it will not be approved." He said, "Applications for extraction rights on land outside the applicant's registered boundary are not approvable under current territorial statute." "No, it will not be approved." She asked whether there was any mechanism by which Yarrow could acquire rights to the formation through a new or amended filing. Caldwell considered this. He said he could file a new homestead expansion claim if the land is eligible and unoccupied. However, land that has been demonstrably improved and occupied, even without a formal claim by the occupant, creates a complication that would require adjudication. It is not a simple process. Winifred said, "I would like to understand what filing I would need to make to establish my occupancy formally." Caldwell looked at her over his spectacles. He said, "Are you asking about a homestead claim?" She said, "I am asking about whatever filing creates the most durable legal standing for a person who has built structures on and occupied a piece of public land for the past 4 months." He brought out a different form from a different cabinet and explained its requirements. She listened carefully and asked 3 questions. She completed the filing in his office that afternoon, using the notebook's survey data as supporting documentation. She rode back to Judith Basin in better weather than she had ridden out in, and she told Oscar what she had done that evening in the rear chamber of the alcove while the March wind tested the door he had built. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You went alone." She said, "Yes." He said, "You could have told me you were going." She said, "I have been handling my own affairs without consultation for longer than I have known you. This was one of my affairs." He looked at the fire pit where the hearthstones were giving back their warmth in the patient way they always did. He said, "That is fair." She said, "When spring comes and we build the cabin, I want it on record that the design is mine. Not because I need recognition, because if I die and you remarry, I want there to be a document somewhere that says a Polish woman from the Carpathians figured out how to build a warm house in Montana and that she figured it out herself." Oscar was quiet again. Then he said something she had not expected. He said, "I know you did not come to Judith Basin looking for a partner. I know what happened at the Tidewater claim. I know you chose this rock for reasons that had nothing to do with me, and that everything you built here, you built before I arrived." She looked at him. He said, "I also know that I told you this place was not proper shelter, and then spent 3 nights in wet blankets in a cabin I built myself, and that you pulled me off a horse in 40 below and kept my hands from going black and did not once say I told you so." She said, "I thought it." He almost smiled. He said, "I know you thought it." She proposed marriage to him in early February, which surprised him enough that he did not answer immediately. She said she was asking for the same practical reasons he would have cited if he had asked her first, his claim. Her knowledge combined resources, the arithmetic of survival, in a place that was harder on individuals than on pairs. She also said she had grown to trust him, which she clarified was not a small thing for her to say and was not said lightly. He said yes. They were married on the 3rd of April, 1874, in Reverend Colquhoun's small congregation in Udita with 47 people present, which was a substantial portion of the settled population within 20 miles. The wedding gift from the community was lumber good milled boards from the Helena supply, enough to build seriously. The morning after the ceremony, Halcott Yarrow received official notification from the Territorial Land Office that his 1871 mineral extraction application had been formally denied on the grounds that the subject formation lay outside his registered claim boundary. The notification had been processed following a secondary review initiated by an inquiry from the Fort Benton office. Winifred learned about the notification's timing from Reverend Colquhoun, who had heard it from the postmaster who had spoken to Yarrow's hired hand at the feed store. She said nothing about it to anyone, but that evening she sat at the table in the alcove that Oscar had built in January and allowed herself for approximately 5 minutes to feel something she did not often permit herself, which was satisfaction. Clean, complete, and entirely private. They broke ground on the cabin in late April when the frost had retreated far enough from the surface to make digging productive. The design was Winifred's, refined from the alcove's principles into something that could function as a permanent home rather than a survival shelter. The north wall went up first, and against it, they packed 3 feet of earth from the hillside, a thermal mass that would buffer the prevailing winter wind and stabilize the interior temperature. The wall construction was double-layered with a 6-inch air gap, the inner surface lined with clay-sealed logs, the outer surface conventional board and batten. The floor was packed earth covered with flat sandstone slabs that had been stacked in the sun for 2 weeks before laying, already holding warmth when they went down. The heating system was built before the roof went on the stone-lined pit, positioned with the same care Winifred had given to the alcove's version, the chimney channel running along the north wall to vent above the roof line. She and Oscar worked side by side on this part without much conversation, which was the kind of working relationship she had come to value. 2 people who understood what they were doing well enough that the work itself was the communication. By the time the first snow fell in October of 1874, the cabin was finished and tested through 3 weeks of early cold that would have been uncomfortable in a conventional structure. The firewood consumption was less than half what Oscar had burned in his railroad-tie cabin the previous winter, which he noted without comment beyond a single nod of acknowledgement. He was becoming a man who expressed things through work and through the particular quality of his attention, which Winifred found suited her considerably better than men who expressed things through words they did not always mean. The alcove they kept. It became what it had always been best suited to be, a root cellar that maintained 45 degrees through all seasons without any effort, a storm shelter that could receive whoever the weather sent without warning, and a classroom. That last function had begun almost by accident in the summer of 1874, when she had found 3 children from the Chen homestead sitting outside the alcove entrance one morning in the July heat, ostensibly watching for her, but more truthfully, with nowhere else to be. She had taught them to read that afternoon, using her husband's notebook as the text, pointing at the terrain names he had written and showing them how the letters assembled into meaning. By August, she had 7 regular students ranging in age from 5 to 14, and the alcove was considerably more comfortable for instruction than the interior of any building in Udita during summer, where the air held its heat like a grudge. Word spread with the efficiency that characterized information moving through isolated communities, and by the following summer, she had parents walking children 4 miles each way to sit in a cave and learn from the Polish woman who had spent a winter in a rock. Orville Ashby came to the new cabin in March of 1874, 3 weeks after the January storm, on an evening when the last of the day's light was going gray behind the Highwood peaks. He knocked. Winifred opened the alcove door and looked at him. He was holding his hat in both hands in front of him, the brim rotating slightly in his grip, which was the only indication that this visit cost him something. He said, "My son-in-law came through the storm in January. He was riding back from Udita when it hit. He found shelter at the rock formation." Winifred waited. Ashby said he described the woman who let him in. "A Polish woman," he said, calm, did not ask questions, just pointed him to a place out of the wind and handed him a blanket. She said he was not the only one that night. Ashby's hands continued their slow rotation of the hat brim. He said, "I told 3 families on the Carroll Trail that your shelter was a death trap. I said it more than once. I said it because I believed it and because I thought I was protecting people." She said nothing. He said, "I was wrong about the ventilation. I looked at the entrance and made a decision about the whole system without seeing the whole system. That is not something I do often, and it is not something I am comfortable with." Winifred looked at this man who had never in her experience of him admitted error about anything. She understood that what he was doing required a specific kind of courage that had nothing to do with physical endurance. The harder kind, the kind that required a person to stand in the presence of someone they had wronged and say the accurate words without softening them. She said, "Would you like to come inside?" He said, "I would." She showed him the alcove, the wall construction, the heating system, the way the stone floor held the day's warmth into the evening. He looked at all of it with the same careful, unmovable attention he brought to everything, and this time he asked questions. Real ones about depth of thermal mass and ventilation ratio, and the relationship between structure height and heat distribution. She answered them in the same register he asked them, without condescension, without the particular satisfaction of explaining something to a person who had doubted it. When he left an hour later, he paused at the door and said, "I have been sending people to the rock formation since February. Anyone caught between here and Udita after dark, I tell them about it. I expect I will keep doing that." She said, "I expect you will." He put his hat on. He said, "I called it the rock shelter, not by your name." She said, "That is fine. It does not need my name to work." He nodded once and walked out into the dark. Halcott Yarrow came one more time in April of 1874, on a morning when the mud had dried enough to ride on without losing shoes. He did not bring a piece of paper. He did not bring a prepared speech. He rode up to the cabin alone and dismounted at the hitching rail that Oscar had put in near the door and stood for a moment looking at the structure. It was a good cabin. It sat low against the hillside with the north wall banked into the slope, and the stone chimney came up clean and straight above the roofline, and the door was heavy and well hung, and there was smoke coming from it with the kind of consistent draw that meant the heating system inside was working the way it was supposed to work. Behind the cabin, the sandstone formation rose against the sky, with its alcove entrance still visible, the door Oscar had built, still in place, the whole enterprise representing 2 winters of accumulated knowledge and labor. Yarrow looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Winifred, who had come to the cabin door when she heard the horse. They looked at each other across 20 feet of spring mud without speaking. His face held the particular flatness of a man who has exhausted his options and knows it, who understands that the next move is not available to him and that the position he now occupies is the final one. He dipped his head slightly. Not a bow, not a gesture of respect, exactly, but the movement a person makes when they acknowledge a fact that does not require comment. Then he mounted his horse and rode east without looking back. Winifred watched him go until the horse cleared the first ridge. Then she went back inside and told Oscar to put more water on because they were having the Muller family for supper, and she had not started the broth. The winter of 1875 came early and intended to stay. The first snow fell on October 29th, a week and a half before anyone had expected it, with the confidence of weather that had made up its mind. By November 12th, the temperature had dropped below zero and established itself there with the permanence of a new fact about the world. The creek froze to the bottom in December, which Winifred had seen happen once before, and which meant something specific about what the rest of the winter intended to do. The old-timers along the Carroll Trail, men who had been in Montana Territory since before the railroad surveys and who had cataloged its winters the way other people cataloged debts, said they had not seen a start like this since the winter of 1856. They said it with a particular tone, not alarm exactly, but the seriousness of people who understood that certain years had a different quality than others, and that the difference was not atmospheric, but almost personal, as though the winter itself had decided to make a point. Winifred and Oscar had prepared for a hard winter because they prepared for a hard winter every year. Their firewood was stacked in the alcove where the constant humidity kept it from drying too fast and cracking. Their food stores were in the root cellar section of the alcove, and the stability of that temperature had preserved things through the previous year in ways that still occasionally surprised Oscar when he checked on them. Dried vegetables that should have gone soft were still firm. Salt pork packed in the right conditions had held its quality through 8 months. They had done everything correctly. The cabin they had built was the best structure within 20 miles of Udita by any reasonable measure. And on January 17, 1875, the temperature in Judith Basin dropped to 52 degrees below zero. Not wind chill, actual air temperature. Winifred was at the fire pit at 4 in the morning when the cottonwood trees in the creek bottom began to go. The sound was unmistakable, a sharp percussive report that carried through the frozen air with the clarity of a rifle shot, and then another, and another ice expanding inside living wood until the wood surrendered to it. She stood at the entrance with the door cracked and listened to the valley cracking open in the dark, and understood that this was not the kind of cold that required extra firewood. This was the kind of cold that rewrote the terms of every agreement previously made between human habitation and the Montana winter. The cabin held at 51 degrees through January 17th and the 18th and the 19th. They burned the fire in the pit, continuously feeding it every 3 hours, regardless of the time, sleeping in shifts. The stone floor held its warmth. The double walls held out the static cold. They were uncomfortable and tired and burning through their wood reserve at a rate that required recalculation, but they were alive and functional and together. On January 22nd, the wind arrived. It came from the north at 61 miles per hour, and it held that speed for 16 consecutive hours without meaningful variation. Winifred had thought about sustained wind as a variable in her construction design, had accounted for it in the placement of the entrance and the orientation of the walls. What she had not fully accounted for was wind at that speed and that duration working on a double wall construction in the particular way that physics required it to. The air gap between the two wall surfaces, which in static cold conditions acted as an insulating barrier, became under sustained wind pressure, a channel. Wind found the small gaps at the base and top of the outer wall and forced itself through in continuous thin streams, and those streams moved through the air gap in a pattern that extracted rather than retained heat, drawing warmth from the inner wall surface, the way a bellows draws heat from coals. By midnight, the cabin interior was at 38 degrees and dropping 2 degrees every hour, and the fire pit was consuming wood at a rate that would exhaust their reserve within 5 days. The door rattled in its frame with a persistence that was not mechanical, but felt intentional, as though the wind understood what it was working against and was committed to the project. At 2 in the morning, Winifred made the calculation and stated her conclusion without preamble. She said, "We go to the alcove now, before we are too cold to make the walk safely." Oscar did not argue. He had learned over the past year to trust the quality of her assessments, which were neither optimistic nor pessimistic, but accurate in the particular way that comes from paying careful attention to how things actually behave rather than how you have decided they should. They dressed in every layer they owned. They packed what they could carry in 2 minutes food, the leather notebook, the lamp and its remaining oil, the wool blankets. They stood at the cabin door and Oscar looked at her and she nodded and he opened it. The wind hit them like a physical object, not a metaphor, a genuine physical force that required immediate bracing and constant resistance to remain upright. The cold was a different order of experience than anything the previous winter had offered, not a temperature, but a presence, something with intention and weight. The alcove was 200 yards from the cabin door. In ordinary conditions, 3 minutes of walking. In this, something else entirely. They held hands. This was practical, not sentimental. Winifred counted steps. She had walked this route in every season and in poor visibility and at night, and she had counted it once in the previous autumn for no particular reason and found it to be 240 steps from her cabin door to the alcove entrance. The number was in her memory with the same solidity as the survey lines in the notebook. At 180 steps, the ground drift reached a density where forward motion became a negotiation with probability rather than a certainty. She could not see her own feet. She could not see Oscar beside her, only feel his hand in hers and the pressure of his weight maintaining contact. At 200 steps, the drift thinned momentarily, and she could see 3 feet of dark air in front of her, which revealed nothing useful about their position. At 220 steps, she became convinced they had angled wrong and were moving parallel to the cliff face rather than toward it. At 230, she was certain of it. At 237 steps, she walked into solid stone. She stood with her palm flat against the sandstone cliff face and felt the rock under her hand and did not move for a moment. Beside her, she felt Oscar's grip tighten on her hand. He had understood what the impact meant. She turned left along the face and found the door and got it open against the wind, and they went through. The alcove was 47 degrees. No wind. The silence was so complete after the sustained roar of the outside that it felt like a different kind of weather. The absence of sound as a physical thing pressing in from every direction. They stood in the front chamber and breathed. Oscar began to laugh. It was not a happy sound. It was the sound that certain kinds of relief make when they have nowhere else to go. They were not alone for long. Before dawn, the Johnson family arrived, all 5 of them, the parents and 3 children who ranged from 4 to 11. Then the Chens, who had built their homestead cabin using the double wall principle Winifred had demonstrated, and whose structure had survived longer than most before the wind found its weakness. Then old Hans Muller, who arrived alone with 2 blankets and a sack of dried beef and the particular quietness of a man who has survived enough winters to know when to stop arguing with one. Then a freight hauler named Patrick Ali, who had been making the Carroll Trail run when the wind came and whose horses had, without any instruction from him, walked themselves directly toward the rock formation and stopped at the entrance with the certainty of animals that had learned something he had not. Finally, near noon on the 23rd, Shelby Foxgrove, who had abandoned his survey camp when the tent began to shred. 13 people in a space designed for 2. Winifred organized the space with the efficiency of someone who had been thinking about its limitations and capacities for over a year. The Johnson family took the rear chamber, the children needing the warmest position in the most stable environment. The others distributed through the front chamber by staying in need with the freight hauler and Foxgrove nearest the entrance, where their bulk provided some additional wind buffer when the door opened. She rationed the firewood with an arithmetic that she did not explain to anyone, because explaining it would have required admitting how precisely calculated their margin was. 1 substantial burn per day morning, building the stones to maximum heat, then letting them give it back through the following 24 hours. 13 bodies in a sealed stone space added warmth that her calculations had not originally included, and she adjusted the firewood schedule accordingly. On the 3rd day, Hans Muller told her she should build the fire larger. He had been watching the temperature in the front chamber, and he believed it was dropping toward uncomfortable levels. He said it in the tone of a man accustomed to his structural opinions being deferred to, which was a tone Winifred had heard from men in various forms throughout her life, and had long ago decided not to adjust her behavior to accommodate. She said, "We have enough heat. We do not have enough wood to burn more of it than we need." He said, "You cannot predict what the temperature will do overnight." She pressed her hand flat against the nearest wall section. She said, "The stones can. I trust them." Muller was not accustomed to being answered this way. He looked at Oscar, who looked back at him with an expression that communicated without any words that this was not a conversation Muller was going to win. The temperature held through the night. On the fourth day, the food situation required attention. Winifred opened the storage section of the alcove where the root vegetables she had packed in September were still in the condition the stable temperature had maintained them firm and usable, not the soft, deteriorated state that 4 months in a conventional cellar would have produced. She brought them out, and the room went quiet, in the way rooms go quiet when people who have been calculating their remaining resources discover that the calculation is less urgent than they believed. Shelby Foxgrove, sitting against the wall with his leather notebook open on his knee, looked at the vegetables and then at the storage section, and then wrote something that took him several minutes. Then he looked at Winifred and said, "You designed this as a complete system from the beginning." She said, "A shelter that only works in emergencies is not a shelter. It is a gamble." He wrote that down too. On the sixth day, the wind stopped. It did not taper. It stopped within the span of a few minutes the way certain decisions stop completely and without announcement. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silence inside the alcove. It was the silence of an absence of something that had been present for 6 days and was now gone. Winifred opened the door. The landscape was reorganized. Drifts 10 feet high against the south faces of every structure. Bare patches of frozen ground where the wind had scoured everything down to nothing. The sky overhead was the hard, brilliant blue of extreme cold that has broken, and the temperature was approximately 10 degrees below zero, which after the preceding week felt like something close to warmth. She stepped outside. Behind her, she heard the others beginning to move, beginning to gather their things, beginning the process of returning to whatever remained of their regular lives. The Johnson cabin had lost its entire roof section. One of the walls was bowed inward at a dangerous angle. The Chen place had collapsed on the windward side, one wall pushed flat by the sustained pressure, the roof following it. Of the 13 people who had spent 6 days in the alcove, 9 returned to find their structures damaged or destroyed. 3 found their homes standing, but compromised in ways that would require significant repair before they were safe to occupy. One family's home stood without meaningful damage. Winifred walked back to the cabin and opened the door and went inside. The interior temperature was 31 degrees cold, but not dangerous, and the hearthstone still held faint warmth from the last burn 6 days earlier. The door was intact. The walls had not moved. The banked earth on the north face had compressed slightly under the pressure, but had not shifted, and the weight of it had actually stabilized the north wall against the wind load rather than adding vulnerability to it. She built a fire at the pit and stood over it while the stones began their work. Outside, she could hear people moving in the changed landscape, voices calling between the damaged structures, the sounds of assessment and loss, and the particular resilient practicality of frontier people encountering yet another version of what this life cost. The death toll for that storm, as it was eventually calculated across Montana territory, was 214 people. Entire families, men caught in the open, livestock by the thousands. Communities that had been functional and established in October were hollowed out by February. The winter of 1875 became the measuring stick against which all subsequent winters were judged. For the next 50 years, the standard reference, when old men in later decades wanted to describe what serious cold actually meant. In Judith Basin, 13 people had spent 6 days underground and come out intact. Winifred was carrying wood from the alcove to the cabin when she heard a wagon on the Carroll Trail below. She set the wood down and looked. It was a Freight outfit, 4 horses, coming from the Fort Benton direction, and something about the way the driver sat on the box was familiar before she could identify why. Florrie Coldwell pulled her horses to a stop at the base of the formation and looked up at Winifred for a moment before climbing down with the deliberate movements of a person who has been sitting on a wagon seat for a long time. She was carrying supplies from Fort Benton for the relief effort that was moving through the valley, milled lumber and flour and lamp oil for the families who had lost the most. She stood in the mud at the base of the formation and looked at the cabin and the alcove and the cleared path between them that showed how recently it had been used. She said in Polish, "I heard what happened here." Winifred said, "What did you hear?" Florrie said, 13 people. 6 days, everyone alive. She reached into the pocket of her heavy coat and held out her closed fist. Winifred came down the slope and Florrie opened her hand. The ring was there. Her grandmother's ring, the plain gold band she had traded on the Carroll Trail in November of 1873 for a broken saw and a hammer with half a handle and a coil of rope. Winifred looked at it and did not speak. Florrie said I kept it because I thought one day you might want it back. Not because you needed it, just because some things should come back to where they belong. Winifred took the ring from Florrie's palm. It was cold from being in the coat pocket, cold the way metal gets in winter, holding the temperature of its last long rest. She held it in her closed hand for a moment, warming it. Then she put it on. She looked at her hand and then at the alcove entrance, and then at the cabin, and then at the valley below where people were beginning the work of rebuilding what the winter had taken. She thought about a morning in November of 1873 when she had stood at the edge of a dead man's claim with a flour sack and nowhere to go and had looked west instead of north. She thought about the first night in the alcove, 47 degrees, when the world outside was 19, sleeping straight through until morning for the first time in 2 years. She thought about her grandmother's voice by firelight in the Carpathian foothills, in a language she no longer spoke every day, but had never forgotten. She said to Florrie, "Come inside. I will make broth." Florrie said, "I cannot stay long. I have 3 more stops before dark." Winifred said, "Then you will have broth quickly." The community rebuilt through that spring with the efficiency of people who had no time to spend on anything other than what was necessary. The settlers who had lost their homes most completely drew on the combined resources of those around them, including the lumber from Winifred's remaining supply and Oscar's labor, which he gave without keeping account because accounting came after survival, and they had not yet reached that stage of things. Among the reconstruction decisions made that spring was a formal resolution by the settlement to maintain the alcove as a communal resource. This was not Winifred's proposal. It was Orval Ashby's. He brought it to a gathering at the Reverend's building in Udita on a Tuesday evening in April, stood up in front of 34 assembled settlers, and said that the rock formation 3 miles west had demonstrated over 2 winters that it was the most reliable structure between Fort Benton and the Judith River, and that it should be stocked with firewood and maintained in advance of every winter by collective contribution, the same way communities maintain their roads and water sources. He called it the rock shelter. He did not call it the Ireton shelter or give it any other personal attribution. Winifred was in the room. She said nothing during the discussion. Afterward, when Ashby passed her on the way out, she said, "Thank you." He said, "I am correcting an error. That is different from doing you a favor." She said, "I know the difference. I thanked you for the correction." He put on his hat and went out. Shelby Foxgrove's report to the Territorial Engineering Office, submitted in the spring of 1875, documented the alcove's construction and performance data across 2 winters in technical terms, precise enough to serve as a replicable design specification. Within 18 months, 7 structures based on its principles had been built at intervals along the major freight routes of Montana Territory, maintained by the communities nearest them, marked on the maps that freighters and surveyors carried. They were referred to simply as stone shelters. Most of the people who used them over the following decades did not know who had built the first one or why. In the summer of 1875, Winifred received a letter from Prue. It was the first communication from her sister since November of 1873. Aldrich had died in the January storm caught in the open between his outbuildings during the worst hours of the cold. Prue was alone on the claim. The letter was 2 paragraphs, practical in tone, asking whether Winifred knew of any work available in the Udita area for a woman with experience in household management and garden cultivation. Winifred read the letter twice. Then she put it in her coat pocket with the leather notebook and walked to the alcove and sat in the rear chamber for a while in the particular quiet that place had always given her the silence under stone that had been the first good sleep she had gotten in 2 years and that she had never entirely stopped being grateful for. She thought about a wall of pine board 2 inches thick and the sound of a voice on the other side of it making a calculation about land. She thought about a doorway and her sister's hands on the frame and the specific nature of choosing silence when speech was possible. She thought about what her grandmother had said, that the ground did not participate in the panic of the surface, and understood that this applied to more than heating systems. It applied to the way a person could choose when tested by what was unforgivable to begin from the present moment rather than from the wound. She wrote back to Prue the same evening. She told her sister that there was a possibility of work at the Mueller homestead where the wife had been asking about household help since the previous autumn. She told her that the road to Udita was improved since the surveying work and that a freight wagon ran the route twice weekly if the weather allowed. She told her that she herself was well and that Oscar was well and that they had 4 months of supplies already laid in for the coming winter. She did not address what had happened in November of 1873. There was no version of addressing it that would be more useful than simply beginning from the present moment, and the present moment contained a sister who had made a wrong choice in a frightened hour, and who was now alone and asking for help, and it contained a woman who had built something that worked in stone and in knowledge, and in the kind of life that grows when you plant it carefully and water it with the daily work of being present and paying attention. She sealed the letter and addressed it and left it with the postmaster in Udita the following morning. Winifred Ireton lived in Judith Basin for the rest of her life. She and Oscar raised 4 children in the cabin that she had designed, and all 4 children learned to read in the alcove. And one of them, the youngest daughter, became a school teacher in Helena and taught in rooms with 4 walls and proper windows, and still told her students that the best thing she had ever learned was that the land had already solved most of the problems people were trying to solve, and that the skill was not in fighting the conditions, but in understanding them well enough to use them. The alcove was in continuous use until 1918. It sheltered travelers and families and animals, and once during the difficult autumn of 1907, a small group of men who were moving through the basin under circumstances Winifred did not ask about, and who left a cord of split firewood stacked neatly beside the entrance when they departed, which she accepted as sufficient explanation of everything. In April of 1903, at the age of 68, Winifred walked the 3 miles to the formation one last time to show her grandchildren where she had lived in the winter of 1873. The oldest grandchild, a boy of 10 with his grandfather's broad shoulders and his grandmother's eyes, stood at the entrance and looked at the hearthstones and the wall construction and asked how long it had taken to build. She thought about it. She said 4 days for the walls, 1 evening for the fire system, 1 winter to prove that it worked, and about 30 years after that to understand what it meant. He looked at her with the slightly uncertain expression of a child receiving an answer larger than the question he asked. She put her hand on the stone beside the entrance, the sandstone that had been absorbing and releasing the heat of fires built inside it for 30 years, that held in its surface the record of every cold night that had been made survivable by what she had built in it. She said, "Your great-grandmother's mother taught me that stone remembers what it has been given." She meant heat, but I think she meant more than that. The boy looked at the stone and then at his grandmother's hand resting on it and seemed to be working out what more than that might mean. In 1967, archaeologists documenting the pre-settlement use of the Judith Basin Formation found the fire pit intact under a shallow layer of accumulated silt. The flat stones of the pit lining still showed heat discoloration from burning. Carbon dating of charcoal deposits confirmed continuous use from 1873 through approximately 1918. Their report noted that the ventilation design was sophisticated and intentional, consistent with knowledge of passive thermal systems, and recommended the site for historical preservation status. There is a marker there now. It is modest, the kind made of treated wood with routed lettering, and it stands at the entrance to the alcove and summarizes in 200 words what took 1 woman, 1 winter to demonstrate. That working with the land was not a concession to difficulty, but a form of intelligence. That the solutions to the hardest problems were often already present in the ground beneath your feet, waiting for someone willing to go down to where they lived and learn what they had to offer. That survival on the frontier was not finally about strength or resources or the thickness of your walls, but about the quality of your attention, the willingness to observe carefully, to learn from whatever source was offering the lesson, and to build accordingly. What the marker does not say, because markers cannot say everything, is that a woman stood on a November morning in 1873 with a flour sack and the memory of her grandmother's voice and looked west toward the rock instead of north toward safety, and chose the harder thing, and that the harder thing turned out to be the thing that lasted.